All right. Thank you, Scott. Yeah, tonight I'd like to talk about a topic we've talked about before, but I think it's been a while. And it's something that comes up a lot. It came up this week in groups that at Seeking Integrity I thought would be a useful topic to review. And that's the topic of letting go, when something has run its course and somehow we as addicts, and I think sometimes also partners, tend to kind of hang on maybe too long when a habit or an issue or an addiction has been around too long. So I want to just talk about letting go a little bit and what that involves and maybe some tips or skills to help. I think we resist letting go. I think I'm speaking as an addict now. I think we resist letting go. We resist change in a major way, and we hold on to things we can't control. And that ends up causing a lot of heartbreak and frustration and a lot of things that just make situations worse. But what it ultimately does is it keeps us stuck in a pattern where we don't grow. And I think when we get into a life full of things that maybe need to be cleaned out a little bit, habits need to be changed, addictions maybe need to be lost, we get stuck. And it's a truism, I think, that when we talk about when an addict really picks up their disease, that's where their emotional aging process kind of freezes. And it's true that I think many adult addicts are really frozen somewhere emotionally in adolescence, and they have that viewpoint and kind of the life skills and so on. So when we remove or let go of things that are holding us back, we open up space. We create space in our life for good things to come in. And that's kind of what I want to talk about tonight. When we attach to things, and this is going back to things we don't want to let go of, when we attach to things that feel good, we get some sensual pleasure, we get some emotional gratification for it, and so on. But we can't get any of that without happiness. And I think happiness is really a big factor that is not there a lot. And those things doesn't mean that we don't need or can't enjoy emotional gratification and pleasure, sensual pleasure. Those are all good things that make life worth living, but they don't necessarily equate with happiness. And I think that's kind of where an addict gets into a trap, because we start thinking, if I can get enough intensity and sensual awareness and excitement and with sex and porn especially, it becomes sexual, sort of a sexual indulgence, then I'll be happy. And that's not the case, right? I mean, countless addicts have gone through there and they don't experience habits. And so holding on to that becomes really a problem. We often have guys come in, part of the process we do sometimes in group is sharing a secret as part of just a way to release shame and just kind of know that everybody does it, right? But I virtually every guy comes in, and when we ask them to reveal a secret, they'll say, well, I have something that I'm going to take to my grave. And I think this is something that really is the mindset of the addict, where you get locked up in a very big way and afraid to move forward, afraid to move backward, and just kind of locked up, even though we know it's not working. So I wanted to go over like 5 tips basically that I found that are really useful to help us go through in this process of letting go, so we can make room for healthier habits, for authentic happiness, for people, for healthy relationships, healthy intimacy, and so on. So the very first step, and it's something that occurs every week in this webinar in the context of the questions, but the very first step is to really stop blaming others. When we're in this, as addicts, we're in this position, we're afraid to move forward, afraid to let go, or kind of afraid to let go of these things, but we're also not taking responsibility for it. And I think this is one of those warning signs about recovery and the state of recovery, in terms of how much am I willing to take ownership of my life and the situations that I've caused. But we often blame others for our misfortunes. And that's something that goes hand in hand with also a victim mentality. We also feel like we're victim, we've been wronged. And this can be a hard one to lose, right? We have people who start to make the transition, they realize they've done a lot of harm, but they'll still, but if only. And then they have a scenario where the responsibility really is somebody else's part and they're the victim. So I think we have to really wash all that away and really be pure about getting rid of that victim mentality and really stop blaming others and take ownership for what we've done, what we've what we've created, and basically ownership for our own happiness. The happiness that we think we are going to gain from holding on to those old habits doesn't work. So I think a couple of things. We don't want to wait for others to fix us. We want to step up and just do it. And we also don't want to wait them to act before we start living our lives. I think it's really important. I was going over this with our guys today on a topic of resilience, where we have to start living right away, even though we're not done. And this is a mistake I made. I think, well, I'll be fully alive when I get to this point or that point or that point. And it's always somewhere down in the future. And I think I was able to sort of find some peace of mind, I think, even though I had a lot of issues still, but I was sober. And I think that's the issue. Sober and trying, sober and starting to connect, sober and healing relationships. And suddenly the whole balance kind of shifted. So bottom line, stop blaming others. Second one, make a decision to let go. We have all these things in our life that we're afraid to let go of. We really have to make a decision. It just kind of can't be haphazard. And I think this is something that's really conscious. It requires us to face our fears. Okay, if I really let go of this, what's going to happen? What's going to be left? What's on the other side? And this is a really key issue for me, at least, in terms of getting sober. I'm not a recovering alcoholic, because I just didn't know what I would be like or who I was without my addiction. And there's a lot of fear. My addiction was as painful and as horrible as it was a known quantity to me. And I was really afraid of how my life might look without it. But so I had to really work those fears and make a decision. And I recommend being really clear on a decision, writing it down and posting it somewhere like we do with an affirmation. It's just really be really clear and specific. I think sometimes when people get kind of muddled about their decisions to do this, they're kind of half in and half out. That doesn't usually produce very good results. So I'd be really clear about what it is you want to lose. And, the addiction is a clear one, but there may be habits, there may be dysfunctional thought patterns, core beliefs, negative core beliefs. I'm not enough, I'm unlovable. All these things that really contribute to our sense of recovery eventually we need to change. We need to let go of. And I think it's sometimes, the other thing I'll just say, because I do a lot with chemsex, as that probably everybody knows, very often people will want to get rid of part of their addiction, but not the other, right? They'll bargain. So I'm going to get rid of my drugs and my, because the meth and cocaine is just making my life unmanageable, but I really want to hang on to porn. I really want to hang on to sexual play or acting out, or whatever they call it. It's a euphemism, really. But we can't do that, right? Once those behaviors have become addictive, we can't bargain, we can't negotiate. So I think to be really clear on that. And that may take a good kick in the from life, from a therapist, from a spouse, from your peers, or whatever, because that at least for me took a little bit of a push to get there. So we make a decision to let go. The third thing we need to think is, or to know, is that to trust that we'll be okay. And I think this is where I think trusting the process, taking a little bit of a leap of faith, knowing that it's worked for thousands of other people and it can work for me. And so I think we have to break through these beliefs that I'm somehow unique, I'm different than everybody else, and it's not going to work for me, or it's not going to be as good, or whatever we tell ourselves to stay stuck. But we have to trust that we'll be okay on the other side. And not that the other side is not without emotional pain or physical pain or loss. One of the things I always tell my clients is that life goes on. I may have gotten into recovery, but life continues, meaning people still get sick, people still pass away. Our circumstances may take a downward turn. There's all kinds of things that happen. We have to deal with that. And we may not have the grace of having a lot of recovery before those things happen. But no matter what, we have tools, we have people, we have a program. And I think that's really, really important to remember when we're on the edge of like, can I bear to let this thing go? There's a funny expression, I didn't mention it tonight, but it's a quote: almost everything in my life that I've had to let go of has scratch marks on it, right? So, and this is like the process of like, I don't want to let this go. And we don't do it gracefully, but we really need to do it. And we need to trust that we'll be okay, because we will be okay. Absolutely. And because guess what? We have people, we have supports, we have a program, we have resources, and we have ourselves. We're awake, we're conscious. We're not in some kind of altered state or off in a fantasy land somewhere or in the bubble or, wherever addicts like to spend their time. Fourth one, when we start to let go, we're going to start to learn a lot of lessons. We're going to learn things about ourselves. And I think we need to see when we have those scratch marks on something, what is it that we're afraid to let go of? What's the lesson there? And what do we feel stuck from? So, when we do kind of let go, I think a great way to analyze that is to really look back and say, what can I learn from this experience? Why was I holding on to that so hard? What hole did that fill? And how can I fill that hole in a healthy way? And so I think really to kind of the same thing, by the way, for a slip or a relapse, we always say it's so important to go back and do kind of an autopsy or a postmortem. What happened? And so it's unfortunate that slips and relapses happen, but they can be really valuable. Once they do, let's see what we can learn from this so we don't have to do this again. And that's the one major lesson of addiction I've learned, is that things keep repeating. It will keep repeating until we do something different. And so that lesson is really key. And then the final thing through all this process of, fear and blaming and making a decision finally and trusting it'll be okay, all that requires some ability and skills at self-regulation. And I think we need to have, and this is going to be a little choppy in the beginning, but I think we get better at it as we go forward through recovery. But learning how to self-regulate. By that I mean, if I get pushed off my emotional center, I need to be able to find my way back to center space, right? I have tools and programs full of tools like that. Therapy is tools like that, where we can kind of talk ourselves back away from the edge of the cliff and be back to sort of normal and regulated again. And those skills to do that are really critical as we go through these really turbulent times of letting go of these pieces of ourselves and our coping mechanisms that are old and don't work so well anymore, but we're just desperately afraid to upgrade to a newer model. So just to summarize that really quickly, I think just to be aware that we often blame, and when we're in this state of resistance, we need to make a decision, a really conscious and firm decision that I recommend writing down. We need to know that we're going to be okay once we go through this process. And that once we go through the process, what can we learn from it? And I think that model is a really healthy one to keep rolling forward in recovery. I think with that, I'll stop. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, David. We got questions in the Q&A feature. We've got one left from last week. Type your questions in. I've got a couple for you here, David. Obviously, if we're an addict, we need to let go of the addiction. What other things might we need to let go of, whether we're an addict or a betrayed partner or who? And second half of the question, how do we know that we need to let go of it? How do we know that letting go is the right decision? Sometimes people get so wrapped up in, is it the right decision or not, that they can't even let go of that.
Absolutely. And you can spin around in that for a long time too. I think there's all kinds of things besides the addiction. One, we may need to let go of people in our lives, right? I had surrounded myself quite consciously by people whose addictions were worse than mine, and made me feel great because I could point to them and say, I'm not as bad as they are, but those were my closest friends, and that wasn't compatible with me in recovery. So I had to let go of some of the people in my life, including some people I considered really good friends. Now I think they were fair weather friends, as addict friends usually are. Some people, and I wasn't in this position, but I know some people have to let go of relationships, right? Some relationships just need to be a healthy separation there, that they're not working anymore. And sometimes that's temporary, right? As a therapist, I often recommend like a therapeutic separation, to get some space. And so you guys don't have to trigger each other all the time, but you can be physically separate spaces, but you can be working on your issues and then come back together in a better place. I mentioned something before, thought patterns, our core beliefs. I may believe that I'm unworthy or unlovable, or that I'm never safe, or I can't be vulnerable. And these are usually messages that we learned based on early childhood trauma stuff. But I think changing some of those, my frame with how I view the world, right? These assumptions I have about how people are, and making some good decisions, changing some beliefs about myself, that I'm not capable of handling myself, or that I can't ever succeed at anything. All this stuff that's sort of the inside job, if you will. And then I think just habits. I think I've recommended sometimes to clients change jobs, change careers. We get intensity addicts that come into seeking integrity who may need to really look at that. They may be the high volume brokers on Wall Street, or the emergency room doctor, all these people that live the adrenaline of their job, and their sex and porn addiction have gotten so wound up in that need for intensity that it's really hard to separate out. And so they may actually have to give up that job and move to something else. So these are hard decisions. And you can see by the kinds of things I'm talking about, if it's my own belief about myself, a relationship with a person, my career, I mean, these are big deals to try to change. There's smaller things too, of course. But to your point, Scott, sometimes we can spin around forever and not really know what the right thing to do is, because these are such major decisions. And in that case, I really recommend consultation. Just really consult with therapists, with friends, with sponsors, with peers, with trusted peers, and just see what the opinion is. I do know in the beginning, for me, and I think it's pretty typical, I didn't have a good sense of up and down. I didn't know what was what, because my kind of internal mechanisms were all broken, and I didn't have a good sense of what was what. So I really needed to outsource some of that intuition and knowledge and get help from people who were more objective than I was about the situation. But I think at some point we just have to do it. And I think my sponsor, I had a couple of situations where I just couldn't make the change. And I had a sponsor who really just said, just do it. And if it doesn't work out, you can do something else. And if it does work out, great. But we can live with the consequences at some point. Now, when we're talking about a marriage or a relationship, that obviously takes a lot of thought and care because there's, more than one person involved. But I think we have some tough choices to make. And as you say, our decision-making capabilities are not that strong in the beginning. So I think we have to really, my technique for that is consultation with other people.
Yeah. And it's one of the things that I was taught in recovery was one of the things I need to let go of is the outcome.
Yes.
And whatever the situation is, I need to do my best. And the outcome is out of my hands a lot of the time. I need to know. I had my level 3 sex addiction online work group today, and we were talking about boundaries. And we have to sometimes, as a healthy boundary, let go of the outcome. I can control my thinking and my actions, but the rest of the world may not be on the same page as me, and sometimes I have to let go of that. And we spent basically our whole 90 minutes today talking about letting go of the outcome, because all my guys, they want to control how they're seen and viewed and treated. Like, you really can't, but what if I'm like, no, there's no but, you do your best and then you just get out of the way, and let go and let God, so to speak.
Exactly.
One of the other things I heard in recovery was, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans, which is basically saying just let go of the outcome, because you're going to be disappointed if you're married to one specific outcome.
Right.
And as an addict, when I'm disappointed, I'm in relapse mode.
Right. And I wanted to just mention, because as an active addict, everything is starting to spin out of control, right? And so the coping mechanism, I guess, or the way we deal with that is to try to clamp down more control on it. And so we're actually moving in the wrong direction from what you just said, in terms of moving toward more control as opposed to really trying to let it go, because that's ultimately what we're going to have to do anyway.
Yeah. There's a passage in the AA book, and I wish I could quote it. My friend Mark can literally quote the whole passage, but it basically talks about, we know we're really getting sober when we stop fighting. Stop fighting other people, stop fighting, the fact that we're an alcoholic. We just stop fighting it. And we kind of do our best and we let life happen. And that's a real sign of sanity and sobriety, I think. And AA seems to agree with that. So
yeah, I agree.
Okay, we've got some questions. We have one left from last week. And it's a really interesting question. Isn't the energy between a couple in an argument an expression of sexual energy? Can you explain sexual energy and how it might be expressed in non-sexual ways. So when we argue, are we expressing sexual energy? That's kind of the question that I want to know. That was kind of a new one for me. But I was like, okay, ask David.
Yeah, I think I'm going to back up a minute to start. Sometimes one of the distinctions we work with the guys in the unit is the difference between intimacy and intensity. And I think the question kind of goes toward the intensity that people feel when they're having an argument. And, anger and that whole flavor of emotion creates a lot of high energy and intensity. And it can feel like a very strong energetic connection, right? I don't think it's necessarily a healthy one, but of course, every couple argues. I do arousal template lectures for the clients, and one of the things I talk about is sometimes a client's bond is that angry energy. And I have known couples who were together, 20 and 25 years who just yell and bicker and angry all the time, but somehow that works for them, so but I don't know, and I guess there's some sexual heat with that, and I don't know if the makeup sex is great in those situations. I don't really know, but I think it's a mistake to confuse the energy that you feel with anger and fighting with sexual energy. I think sexual energy and sensual energy needs to be kind of kept a little bit separate from that. I think anger just introduces a lot of other kind of more toxic emotions into the process. But I do think what the person that wrote the question is really thinking about is the intensity of it. And I think the intensity can be confusing because, yeah, it's intense if you're arguing with somebody, and sexual or sensual connection is also intense. But I think the anger piece, and of course, every couple, has anger issues at some time or another. But if that's your main connection, I think that can be kind of problematic ultimately for people.
Yeah, and I think some of the confusion might be, I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't argue with people that I don't care about. That I'm just,
Sure.
I only argue with people that matter. So if I'm constantly fighting with someone, it shows that they matter and that I matter to them if they're arguing back. And maybe that can be sexualized, but yeah, I agree with you. I wouldn't want to equate that with sexual energy. It's just an intensity that may feel like sexual energy. And I've heard people say, "Ooh, angry sex is the best sex," and I'm like, not for me, thank you. I no, not into that. But everybody's arousal template is different. So I thought that was an interesting question. So.
But when we talk about, what is, and my life's work is trying to find a different word, but healthy sex, okay?
Yeah.
But healthy sex is affirming. Healthy sex is reinforcing. Healthy sex is more compassionate and empathic than what I assume would be an angry kind of interaction, right? And so I just think it gets confusing for people. But I would encourage a couple that does that to try other ways of stoking up sexual heat that doesn't involve anger or bad feelings.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump into the Q&A feature here. How can you tell an addict has stopped trying to bargain with what they've let go of? And the example here is giving up overt acting out, but still holding on to some things that they think they can control, putting them in the yellow circle instead of the red circle. I run into this a lot. Guys want to put porn in the yellow circle instead of the red circle. we usually talk them into the red circle pretty quickly, but thoughts on that? I mean, holding on to stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what we're talking about tonight, and that idea of surrender is so important, and it's a process, right? And I think people do kind of let go. We talked about those things with scratch marks on them. Sometimes one thing at a time or a couple pieces at a time, and they try to bargain, as the exact word used here, to kind of see what's going on and see if they can hold on to something. I think the way we do it, the way I can tell or try to tell, two ways. One is behavior. What are my eyes telling me? What am I seeing? And am I seeing change? So I use my eyes. I don't pay attention to what is coming out of people's mouths because, addicts generally talk and make excuses and make apologies, and they're words, and they end up being kind of empty words that end up being very hurtful for people when they've heard them over and over again, but no behavior change happens. So behavior change, and also then attitude. I think we mentioned earlier blaming, resentment, projecting onto somebody else, not taking responsibility, being like a victim, that kind of emotional flavor of stuff is a bad sign to me. And it's not necessarily a sign that all is lost, but it's certainly a sign that this person is still in the process of bargaining and going through that grief process. Remember, grief has bargaining kind of in the middle, and anger too. But acceptance is where we need to be at the end of a grief process. And somebody who's doing that is not at acceptance. So I would watch behavior, and I would watch the attitude, how the person interacts with other people.
Yeah, and one of the words that we hear is surrender, and it's actually used at the beginning of this question. I didn't read that part, but in 12-step groups, sometimes they'll say you have to surrender to win, and they're not talking about surrender to the fact that the addiction is more powerful than you. They're talking about surrender to the reality that you have an addiction, meaning accept you have an addiction and you need to do something about it. Right. And that you can do something about it. That's what we mean when we say surrender. And when we say let go, we don't mean you're weak and whatever. We mean empower yourself by letting go.
Right.
Right. Okay. Next one here. My husband's therapist says he is a sex and love addict, but there's a spectrum and he isn't an extreme case. He's trying to make me feel better that he isn't out with hookers, at strip clubs, having affair partners. He sexted with one person and spent a year 6 times visiting a couple where he watched and masturbated. He has done a full therapeutic disclosure on polygraph, but I'm still not 100% sure I have the complete truth. Can you comment on the spectrum of, are some sex and love addicts worse than others? Also, is masturbating to porn on occasion okay in recovery? If he isn't, and he says he's not a porn addict. So a lot of questions in there for you, David.
Yeah. So, this idea of a spectrum, there's a range of behaviors. I think the idea of describing it as a spectrum is something I kind of shy away from.
Yeah, it's like being a little bit pregnant.
Yeah, a little bit pregnant. To me, the idea of being an addict is kind of crossing a line, and there you are. Now, what behaviors any specific addict has may vary a lot. But, I mentioned earlier, I'm an alcoholic. I was a daily drinker at the end, but for a while, I, as a way of proving to myself I wasn't an alcoholic, went a long time between getting drunk, right? I would go sometimes months. And so I really convinced myself, well, it's only, once every 3 months, what's the problem? But when I drank alcoholically with blackouts and the whole thing. So I think every sex addict has different range of behaviors they have. I'd really hesitate to call it a spectrum, because that implies that, this is just a little bit, and therefore a little bit of intervention would be okay, as opposed to doing the whole recovery thing. I think that's a little bit of a word game and any addict, any good addict is going to take and run with it, right, to find the loopholes in that, because there's a whole lot of room there. For me, because of denial, because of our own ability to fool ourselves, I think it's a mistake to think of addiction as anything less than a line we cross. There's very specific criteria that show that we have, arrived at that diagnosis, and it's not one that's incremental. There's different criteria. You can have some or more than others in terms of the criteria, but not in terms of the behaviors. And I think one of the really challenges for a lot of sex addicts who are new in recovery is they may go into an SAA meeting or SCLA meeting or whatever recovery group and say, look around the circle, say, well, I never did that, or I never did that, or he's so much worse than I am. And suddenly I don't belong in this group, right? And then we can talk ourselves right out of it. So I really encourage any addict to look for what they have in common with other addicts, whether you're in a room, whether you're in a discussion. How do I relate to this person? What does he or she have or do that I also do, as opposed to saying, well, he does this on Wednesdays, but I only did that on Tuesdays. That doesn't really help. So Scott, I'd love to hear what you get to think about that.
Well, I just told you it's like being a little bit pregnant. You are or you aren't. You know, and I totally agree with you. Like, just because he's done a whole bunch of behaviors, and I'm like, I'm reading this going, oh, I never did that. Because I didn't. But I did a whole bunch of other stuff, and trust me, I'm a sex addict. But in early recovery, I did exactly what David described, and be like, well, I've never done that. I'm not as bad as they are, and I don't need to be here. And it's only, we go back into our denial. So saying you're not an extreme case, I'm not a big fan of that either. This spectrum, you are or you aren't. If you're an addict, you need to be in recovery. If you're not an addict, but you've cheated, you need to be in a different kind of healing. So yeah, I'm 100% on board with you. Let's talk a little bit about disclosure. He has done a full therapeutic disclosure with the polygraph that I'm assuming he passed, but I'm still not 100% sure I have the complete truth. David, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think I've known people that have passed a polygraph who later went on to say they hadn't been totally revealing about everything. Usually the polygraph will have something like, have you answered all these questions correctly? And it's a yes or no, as opposed to being polygraphed on all the various details, right? So, it's hard to say. Given the murkiness of how this person has sort of 1 foot into addiction and 1 foot out, I would be kind of suspect, I guess. But it's hard to say. I can't say with any kind of certainty if that's true or not. I do know sometimes that partners can be overly, anxious about stuff when the addict is making every good faith effort to, do the work. And this is where it's, how can I prove to you that I'm really 100% in, right? And the only way I can do that is through my behavior consistently, day in, day out, over time. So I don't know. Scott, what do you think about that?
I don't know. I'm a much bigger fan of the polygraph than some of the people on our staff. If I do a full therapeutic disclosure and pass my polygraph, I've probably told you everything to the best of my ability. Now, I may remember things later. And if so, I need to amend my disclosure. And usually in a full therapeutic disclosure, there's a process for that. Oh, I remembered something I need to share with you. Let's set it up so I can disclose. But at some point, I always tell betrayed partners, trust your gut. So I'm telling you, trust your gut, but I'm also saying, what more do you need? You may have to say, here's what else I need so that I can get to 100% knowing I have the truth. That's a tough one. That's why I kind of threw it to you first, David. I don't really have an answer. I do want to ask you this next one. Is masturbating to porn on occasion okay in sex addiction recovery? He isn't a porn addict, so he says. So what are your thoughts on that, David?
Again, in early recovery, for sure, I think masturbation, this is just brain science. The brain gets so off center through these processes of dopamine downregulation and stuff with all the intensity of sex and porn addiction that the brain needs some time. And so we recommend a period of abstinence with no masturbation. Now, masturbation is a whole other thing that can go in different circles, and over time, of course, it can move around. Porn, I believe, stays in the middle circle, at least certainly in the beginning. My concern,
meaning the inner circle, the red circle.
So the red circle, yeah.
So is this why I use red, yellow, green?
Yeah, so let me do that. Good point. So in the red circle, in the bottom line, behaviors, I've lost my day count circle. The problem with porn is that, and there's guys that haven't used porn as their primary mode of acting out, but porn is so seductive in terms of how it works with the brain. It's so easy to get into it and get caught up in it. I really worry about for any sex addict to go there. And I'll take it a step further. I really feel that Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all of those so-called not porn things are also problematic, because every client we've have is edging on dopamine on those sites. You know, it doesn't have to be explicit porn. So I think we have to kind of be real about how fantasy and sex addicts can use these different modes of stimulation to get that dopamine flowing, which is the addiction payoff, if you will. And there's all kinds of ways to do it. And I think just putting porn in there just complicates it immensely, in my point of view.
Yeah. Every sex addict I know is also a porn addict to some degree. Not every porn addict has behaviors other than porn, but everybody who classifies as a sex addict, they probably have a problem with porn in today's world, because it's so easily accessible, it's so ubiquitous, it's so easy to hide, and it's so easy to justify. It's, you know, and it's the one thing that porn and masturbation, with or without porn, are the things that guys always want to put in the yellow circle. They want to say, oh, it's slippery, but it's not a bottom line behavior because I don't do it every day, and this is the real problem, not that, you know. They always want that loophole. And, you know, my answer is, okay, put it in your red circle for now. We'll revisit it in 6 months, you know, because nobody ever died because they didn't see porn for 6 months, or they didn't masturbate for 6 months. You know, nothing happens. You don't get colon cancer if you don't have an orgasm for 6 months. Nothing happens except you don't have an orgasm for 6 months. So, you know, I always push guys to put it in the red circle and say, you know, if they're really sticky, I'll say, talk to me in 3 months. We'll revisit it in 3 months, and then we put it off for it, you know. And a lot of times masturbation will come back into like yellow circle instead of red, but porn almost never goes back into the yellow circle. No sex addict needs to be looking at porn, period. And not porn, which David mentioned, is the same thing as porn. It's, you know, it's social media sites, it's bikini pictures, it's, for me, Game of Thrones, too many naked people doing sexy things. I can't watch Game of Thrones. It's not porn, it's on HBO. It would be really easy for me to justify, but it also would send my brain into the spin and, you know, the neurobiology, which we could get into and talk the rest of the hour on. But the brain needs time away from this stuff to heal. Yeah, I'm
and your brain can heal for 5 years and be away from it, and all it takes is 2 minutes looking at porn and you are back.
Yeah,
you know, you're hooked again. And so
yeah, it's a drug.
It's a drug.
Yeah. Okay. This is from the betrayed partner. Discovery of my husband's porn addiction was May 2020. He has been working recovery since then. In August of 2022, I discovered overly friendly texts to female colleagues. September, I discovered an emotional affair had been happening for 18 months. In November, there was an anonymous complaint late at work over objectifying inappropriate behavior with female colleagues. My husband says he didn't realize these behaviors were part of his addiction. He is a regular to your webinar and posted a question back in July around his work behaviors. You both described it as active addiction. We've not had disclosure. His therapist said he's not ready. He says he doesn't know how to gauge or address his emotional sobriety. We both feel stuck, and I'm increasingly hopeless. What do we each separately need to be doing? Help, please. My husband is listening with me today. So I remember this question. And I think it was in this group. And we did label it as active addiction. I remember it. But David, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is something we see a lot, where people may stop their, you know, overt sexual acting out, but it kind of spills over into these other innocent interactions, right? The guys that whose Facebook friends are all women, pretty women, or Scott talks about a guy he goes to a program with who flirts with waitresses, but not waiters. You know, these kind of things are where it starts to show up. And the workplace, of course, where everybody gets thrown together, is a prime place where this can happen. And, you know, if it's been escalated to the point of a complaint, where sort of boundaries have been crossed, that's a real problem. And so, yeah, I think this is definitely part of the addiction. It's a more subtle version, but remember, a lot of sex addiction is all about getting validation from people, it's about power and control. It's about, getting attention. So I think these are all kind of unhealthy behaviors. I think the solution here, at least for your husband, is boundaries, right? Boundaries at work. And we've had guys with discharge plans who would, they never have a woman in their office without the door open. They don't take business trips with women. They don't, to really just protect themselves and their family, because they have to keep it that pure and clean in terms of boundaries because of this kind of behavior. It's subtle. I do think if an addict is being honest with themselves, they really know what they're doing here. So I think it's just a matter of really breaking through that next level of honesty. I talked earlier tonight about letting go. I think really kind of making a decision to let go of some of this behavior, because it's just keeping you, I'm talking about the addict here, keeping them in that state of engagement with some of those addictive processes. And when I'm engaged in an addictive process, there's no room for me for recovery in my brain, right? There's no growth there, because he's still actively engaged in this. So I think this is something I would take to his therapy and his sponsor and his program, because I think his definition of sobriety really needs to be expanded to include these workplace scenarios. In terms of
workplace scenarios often signal a need for a higher level of care, do they not, David?
Oh God, yeah. Right. When we have these kind of boundary crossings, which, by the way, in the Me Too era, can really be can be consequential. But yeah, I think these kind of boundaries, and especially where it's subtle, and sometimes the addict does or doesn't realize it. I think in most cases, and if they're honest with themselves, they do. But sometimes these behaviors really require some work on an inpatient setting or residential setting. So I think, yeah, Scott's right about that. This is a entrenched policy, and I think if somebody just tries to manage this on their own without really strong guidance, it can be problematic. Now, for the partner who also asks what can she be doing, I think just really getting support from yourself, getting context with your support network, and also having really clear boundaries. Working with your CSAT or your therapist, if you have one, hopefully, to develop boundaries about what your expectations are and what this is going to look like. Because yeah, I think this is not something that we can parlay our way into saying it's okay, go ahead. This really needs to change before something even worse happens.
Yeah, and I strongly suspect that after initial discovery of porn addiction in 2020, and it was all the way into the middle of 2022 before these other behaviors are found out, there was a lot of still secret keeping, and that who knows what else is under there. And it's hard for even a really good CSAT to dig everything out if the husband isn't disclosing. And sometimes this is why we need to up the level of care. Both of you need to have a CSAT. Inpatient is definitely on the table for discussion, and support groups and all of that stuff. But the addict here really, really, truly needs a circle plan that reflects the full gamut of his behaviors, instead of just what he's aware of or willing to disclose. And maybe this is everything. It's entirely possible this is everything. But I don't know that, and I don't know that he's we've got some denial to break through, I think, is
for sure.
Yeah.
I'll say one other thing. I have come across addicts who have had a pattern of acting out with people in very kind of sex addiction kind of ways, power and control, conquest, the excitement, the intensity, the transactional stuff. And then sometimes in recovery, they fall into a different pattern or experience a different pattern. And that's an emotional connection with a woman that may be very different from the kind of relationships or patterns they had before. And I've had guys who didn't understand this was also part of their addiction because it felt different. It was emotional. How could this be my addiction? I have a connection, and it's part of the addiction. It's love and romance addiction, and it goes very much with sex addiction.
Yeah, David mentioned my friend that I used to have dinner with. He's since moved away, but we would have dinner and he would always flirt with the waitress, but never the waiter. And he's a recovering sex addict, and I would point this out to him, and he insisted that he was just being friendly. But the fact of the matter is, he was on his third job after losing very high-powered, high-paying gigs, after losing not once, but twice because of his behavior at work, because he was overly friendly. And he was really working to wrap his head around that. And, I was like, if your wife was sitting on your shoulder watching you and hearing you, how would she feel about this? Oh, well, she's always, I'm like, no, she's right, you're wrong. But yeah, and this is easy for men to justify, particularly if you're in a job with, the old boys network kind of going on. So yeah. Hi, recovering porn addict here. I am married. We're about 3 months post-discovery. I am struggling with a lot of shame and guilt. I'm active in a 12-step program and seeing a CSAT twice a week, but I'm reminded daily of my mistakes and the impact they've had on my wife and family. I'm just struggling with being able to get past the shame and guilt. Any thoughts on this in the early stage of recovery? Thank you. Great question.
Yeah, great question. And I'm sorry you're feeling this, but good for you. That tells me you're really working an honest program and you're feeling your feelings. And that's really going to be a great foundation for the future for you. Shame and guilt, this is a universal thing, especially in early recovery. I think every addict I know had a lot of shame before they ever got involved in an addiction, and the addiction just compounds it. And so by the time we are ready for recovery, we have a whole lot of shame. Shame in the context of addiction really doesn't have any value from my point of view. It just kind of bogs people down. There are areas where shame does, but shame in this context about what I did, and what we encourage people to do is to move that from shame over to guilt. Guilt being at least feelings about what I did. Shame really implies not so much feelings about deeds that I've done, but about me. Shame is about me being flawed, and it's a much more devastating and unhealthy kind of self-perception of just being damaged goods, basically. Not because of anything I did, just because of me. And so I think that can really be pervasive for sex addicts in the beginning. And so I think it's really, we have an affirmation we use with our clients. I'm a good man who did bad things. And it kind of separates it. It speaks to that separation between the shame core, that's like, I'm just a terrible person, versus I'm a mixed up person who has done some terrible things as a result of my addiction. And those terrible things I have to take responsibility for and work with and make amends for and do all that. But if we kind of move it over into the guilt column, we can sort of work with that and move it. Because right now what I'm hearing is you're very stuck in those feelings and kind of swimming around in them. And that's what shame will do. Shame, because there's nowhere to go with it. It's just it's me. But if guilt, we can work through stuff, and eventually that does start to lift and get better. You're in CSAT twice a week, you said, right? Yes. Okay, good. So therapy is going to be really helpful for this. I'd really recommend, if you're not familiar with Brene Brown, looking at some of Brene Brown's videos or books. She does a lot of work with shame. And her notion, and by the way, with shame is once it gets out into the sunlight, it kind of goes away. Shame thrives in secret, dark places. And so one of the things we do in treatment often is to help ask people to talk about their secrets and give away that shame so they can move it and get rid of it. But I'd encourage you to kind of think about what you've done, not about what a bad person you are, but a good person who's done bad things, and then work with that with your CSAT. And they can really help you a lot, I think, from that point on.
Yeah. Next one here. Do you have any recommendations for additional resources for someone with sex addiction and ADHD besides medication? My recovery process has been significantly delayed because of how difficult it is for me to create healthy habits. because I have a hard time with consistency, time management, etc. I am putting in the chat feature, which I think everyone can read, links to 2 podcasts, one with David and Dr. Todd Love, and one with Dr. Rob and Dr. Todd Love. Todd Love, Todd, not Troy, who's one of our webinar hosts. And this is his specialty. Definitely listen to these podcasts. David, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, so Todd talks about, who also, by the way, has ADHD himself, and he's a therapist, so he has a dual perspective. But he talks about someone who's really ADHD, has a deficiency in certain chemicals, and these medications will actually help bring those back to where they should be, and not excessively, like we often think about with the stimulant meds that are given. Even so, I understand the reluctance to take the medication, although it can be helpful for people. The certain kinds of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, has shown some effectiveness with ADHD as well. So there's certain kind of skills, ways of thinking, tools that you can use to kind of keep on track and stay connected. We find, I think it's about 20%. There's a high level of co-occurrence between ADHD and sex addiction. So you're certainly not alone. But it does make it so much harder, I think, to focus sometimes and to really do the work. So I highly recommend Todd's work. And Todd also, I believe, has a book out. But anyway, Todd Love would be a great resource for you in this regard. But also check with your therapist, if you're seeing one, I assume you are, about resources, because basic cognitive behavioral therapy skills might be able to help. Also, I mentioned in this webinar a lot about DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is basically just a whole set of skills that are very useful for the addict and for anybody really, but especially for the addict in recovery. DBT doesn't deal specifically with ADHD, but there are a lot of skills within DBT that I think would be helpful for you.
Yeah, if you want to know more about DBT, just go to our YouTube channel, type in DBT David Fawcett, and it'll take you right to it, because we've done a couple webinars talking specifically about DBT. So David is an expert in DBT. Okay, next one is probably our last one for the day. New betrayed partner here. Is it better to have my husband learn about the betrayed partner experience from me or our therapist? I've got down the rabbit hole of betrayed partner research since discovery, but I'm not sure about the best route to take. Interesting question. I will throw out there. We have online work groups called Out of the Doghouse, which are walking addicts through the betrayed partner experience so they can understand what their betrayed partner is going through. That's a great way for him to learn about it. And Dr. Rob's book called Out of the Doghouse is a great way to learn about the betrayed partner experience. But as far as hearing it from the betrayed partner or the therapist, what do you think, David?
First of all, I really endorse what you just said about the work groups and Rob's books. Amazing in terms of bringing that experience to life. I think it's very beneficial for the addict to hear it from everybody, frankly. I think, he needs to hear it from the spouse. That first person accounting is really important. I think sometimes the timing of those interactions is also really important. It may be best that those kind of discussions, if you will, happen down the road a little bit, where when the addict kind of is able to listen. I think early on, when people are in their kind of denial mode, everything's about pushing back and fighting and making excuses, and they're not really hearing it, especially from their wife or husband. I think if they may hear it from their therapist, but I think most often they hear it as a matter of circumstance or from their groups. So from all of the above. So I think I wouldn't, if you have something to say, I would definitely say it. I don't think it would be wise to put a lid on it. However, I'd be cautious about the presentation if you can, and maybe it might be useful. And I find this really helpful to have a couple. And I recommend couples therapy down the road, like after disclosure. However, in early recovery, it doesn't hurt sometimes to go in for a session just to get some communication skills, how to talk, how to argue effectively without, burning the house down, right? So there's different kinds of skills, but I don't think there's any one source that is the perfect source for this. I think it has to happen from everybody. And but
Yeah.
but don't, and the partner's voice is incredibly important in this too. I don't want you not to say anything, because that's really important. And also, just a word you mentioned down the rabbit hole, that one of the strategies of a betrayed partner makes perfect sense for emotional safety is to get information. I got to learn about this. I got to find this out. Become super detectives and all that, and you can make yourself insane. So, because there's never enough information really to solve that anxiety. So, take the information, find it that you find useful. When you hit your limit, step away from it for a while, and then go back, because it can get really overwhelming.
Yeah. And I'll give you one more betrayed partner resource, which is not ours. It's called partnerhope.com.
Yeah.
It's a website run by Michelle Mays on the East Coast, and she's a specialist with betrayed partners. I find her brilliant. She has a regular blog for betrayed partners that's amazing, and she's got a book coming out, should be out now, although I don't think it is. And I don't know why not, but it's coming. So look up Michelle Mays, partnerhope.com. We do have a question left, but it is one that is going to require more time than we have to answer. So I'm going to save it for next week. I want to acknowledge that it's here. It's a great question. We will answer it first next week, so please come back. David, thank you for talking about letting go today, and for your time and expertise. Anything you want to say to take us out?
Just letting go is hard, but we have to do it. We have to do it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back next week. We'll see you then.
Thanks, Scott. Good night.